Picture someone pulling up a message on their phone, not searching for it. It's already there, saved, time-stamped, and they can look at it anytime they want, as many times as they want. The fact of it isn't in question. What's in question for them is whether they're still allowed to trust their own read on what it means. That's not the facts changing. That's something else changing first. Confidence in the ability to read them at all. Welcome back to Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams. This is episode 4 in our series on betrayal trauma, and today we're going deep into one question: what actually happens in a person's mind when someone close to them keeps insisting that what they know isn't real? Quick recap. Last episode, we talked about gaslighting as a pattern, denial, redefinition, blame, reversal. Today, I want to go further into the mechanics because there's a lot more research here, and it splits into two separate injuries. One is what happens to memory itself, mostly in the moments where there's no screenshot to point to, the tone of voice, the excuse that didn't quite add up, the night that felt off. The other is what happens even when the screenshot exists, when the fact itself is completely settled, and the fight moves to what it's allowed to mean. We're going to cover both, and I want to start with memory because it's one of the few parts of this that's actually been tested in a lab. Researchers ran an experiment on memory. They had people recall an event, then a partner challenged that memory, then separately, a stranger challenged the exact same memory using the exact same words. The partner's challenge did more damage. People were more likely to accept a false version of events, and their confidence in their own recall dropped further than it did with the stranger. Here's the detail that stayed with me. The effect didn't need the partner in the room to keep working. People kept second guessing their own memory even later, alone, with no one there to argue with because the pressure had already gotten inside. Try this for a second. Imagine you remember a conversation clearly, and every time you bring it up, your partner says, "That's not what happened," not once, repeatedly, until eventually you stop just questioning them and start questioning yourself. That's the mechanism in one sentence. A partner's denial doesn't just contradict a memory. Under the right conditions, it can start to edit it. Why does a partner's voice carry that much power over someone's own mind when a stranger saying the exact same thing barely touches them? Close relationships run on what's called a resistant prior, years of trust that make the brain slow to doubt this one specific person. That's useful. Most of the time, it's why people don't reinterrogate a spouse's honesty every single day. But it has a dark flip side because that same trust hands them unusual power to overwrite someone's memory, specifically because their guard is down in a way it isn't around anyone else. So that's the first injury. What happens to memory when there's no hard proof to anchor it? Now, here's the second one, the one that matters even when the proof exists, the message pulled up on the phone, time-stamped. Undeniable. Because having the proof doesn't end the fight, it just moves the fight somewhere else. And here's a term worth knowing for that, because once you have it, you'll start noticing it everywhere. Testimonial injustice. In plain terms, it means this: an account of what happened isn't treated as valid on its own. It needs someone else's approval before it counts, like a claim that has to clear a checkpoint before it's allowed to be true. Researchers call the resulting feeling becoming an epistemic other, still allowed to describe what happened, just not trusted to say what it means. The voice becomes raw material. Someone else does the interpreting. Now zoom out because this gets bigger than one relationship. There's a theoretical framework some researchers built specifically to explain how gaslighting works, step by step, and I think it's genuinely useful. Here's the core idea. Every person has two needs that are supposed to work together: the need to know what's real and the need for connection with people they love. And in a healthy relationship, those two needs support each other, while in a gaslighting dynamic, they get pitted against each other on purpose. Here's how that plays out. The gaslighter keeps signaling quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, that the other person's read on reality can't be trusted, and over time, that creates a real dependency. Since they can no longer fully trust their own read on things, they start leaning on the gaslighters instead, which is exactly the position the gaslighter wanted, and they become the authority, not because they earned it, but because they dismantled the alternative. Researchers describe something happening at a fairly deep cognitive level here, something close to what the brain does when it's trying to predict the world and keeps getting fed bad information. Over time, a person's internal sense of what to expect gets less precise, and they stop trusting their own predictions. Some people describe this as a kind of dissociation, a split between what they believe and what they're actually perceiving in the moment, not because anything is wrong with them, but because the input they've been trained on has been corrupted deliberately for a long time. There's a related idea that I think deserves its own moment because it's specific and it's sharp. Some researchers call it narrative gaslighting or mnemonic interference. And here's the plain version: it's not just messing with one memory, it's an attack on someone's ability to narrate their own life at all, to string events together into a story that makes sense and is actually theirs. Think about what that costs. A person's sense of who they are isn't built out of isolated facts. It's built out of the story they tell about those facts. And if someone keeps corrupting the story piece by piece, they're not just making the other person doubt one Tuesday night, they're making it harder to trust the whole book. And here's something I didn't expect to find in this research, but it makes sense once you hear it. This kind of manipulation doesn't only affect thinking. Researchers describe it disrupting something they call embodied agency, meaning a person's basic felt sense of being someone who is actually here, actually deciding, actually moving through their own body and their own choices. We talked in episode 1 about dissociation as a response to trauma generally, and this is a more specific version of that. Gaslighting doesn't just live in the head, it can make someone feel less anchored in their own body, less like the author of their own actions. Let's slow down on one more piece because I think it explains something people often can't quite name. Some people, once betrayal threatens their idealized picture of their partner, actually work harder to defend that picture, and not because they're naive. Here's why. A lot of people build part of their own identity around having chosen well. If my partner is good, that says something good about my judgment, my worth, my future. So when the evidence says otherwise, defending the idealized version of the partner is also quietly defending the self. That's not weakness. That's a person trying to protect the floor they're standing on. Now, here's a pattern I think is worth naming plainly because a lot of people do this without realizing it has a name. Researchers call it testimonial smothering. It's not being silenced by someone else in the moment, it's silencing oneself in advance. Because a person already knows from experience exactly how it'll go, they'll be doubted. Or worse, whatever they say will get used against them later, so they just don't say it. This isn't passivity, it's a prediction built from real evidence. And often it's an accurate one. This matters even more once you widen the lens beyond one marriage. Researchers studying testimonial injustice in completely different contexts, women entrepreneurs navigating gender bias in business, for instance, found the exact same underlying pattern. People whose knowledge already gets treated as less credible by the culture around them, women in patriarchal settings being a clear example, are more vulnerable to this kind of manipulation specifically, not because they're more gullible, but because the self doubt has already been primed by the wider world before any one relationship even starts working on it. Gaslighting doesn't invent vulnerability out of nothing, it often finds a crack that was already there and widens it. There's one more specific form of this worth naming because I think it's easy to miss. Some researchers call it anger gaslighting, and it's not about facts at all. It's about whether someone's anger is allowed to be reasonable. Here's what that sounds like. A person has every right to be furious, and instead of that anger being received as appropriate, it gets treated as the actual problem. You're too much. You're being dramatic. Your anger isn't fair to me. Notice what's happening there. It's not memory being challenged this time. It's the right to feel the thing any reasonable person would feel in that position. And that's its own category of harm, worth naming on its own. This kind of credibility discounting doesn't stay contained inside a marriage either. Researchers studying what's sometimes called medical gaslighting have found the same basic pattern showing up in doctors' offices, where a patient's account of their own body gets waved away, minimized, second guessed. People who've had that experience repeatedly in healthcare settings often start avoiding care altogether unless something becomes truly unavoidable and it's the same core injury. Someone in a position of trust deciding another person's account doesn't need to be believed. I want to name the more extreme end of this spectrum too, because the research doesn't shy away from it. When this pattern goes on long enough, researchers describe something they call hermeneutical death, meaning a person's capacity to actually participate in making sense of their own life, to interpret it, to have a voice in what it means, becomes profoundly constrained. That's a heavy phrase, and I'm including it because I think it's honest about how serious the stakes actually are here. This isn't only about one difficult argument. Left unaddressed, it can reach into someone's basic capacity to be a meaning making person in their own story. One more piece worth naming before we turn toward recovery. Some of this manipulation isn't built entirely out of fabrication. Researchers describe gaslighting as having what one calls a two faced quality. Sometimes the person doing it has actually noticed something real and true about their target, some real insecurity, some real sensitivity, and wraps that true thing in distortion, using the kernel of accuracy to make the whole package feel more believable. That's part of why this is so disorienting. It's rarely a pure lie someone can simply reject. It often comes packaged with just enough truth to make them hesitate. I also want to mention something clinical because I think it validates a lot of what we've covered today. Some researchers have specifically flagged what they call diagnostic blind spots around serial infidelity combined with gaslighting, arguing that clinicians sometimes miss it entirely, treating it as a personality clash or a communication problem rather than what the evidence increasingly suggests it actually is, a trauma response that deserves trauma informed assessment. For anyone who's ever felt like their distress was being treated as an overreaction, even by professionals, this research suggests that gap is real and it's being named. So, how does this actually get better? The research does have something to say here, and I don't want to skip past it. Recovery tends to start at a specific moment, not a slow fade, but a break, usually when evidence becomes solid enough that it's simply undeniable. Once that happens, something shifts, and the partner's version of reality stops being the automatic checkpoint a person's own perception has to pass through because that person's credibility in the other's eyes has genuinely collapsed. What helps after that point? Researchers point to a few specific things: time spent with people who actually have faith in someone's judgment, people who treat their account as credible from the start, and that kind of steady belief from someone else, researchers found, helps rebuild faith in oneself. Having emotional reactions specifically validated by someone else matters too, being told clearly the anger made sense, the hurt made sense, which helps restore confidence that one's own evaluative judgment still works. And there's something researchers called re embodying activities, physical movement, direct sensory experience, anything that reconnects a person to their own body's signals instead of a version of reality that's been filtered through someone else the whole time. I'll say what I always try to say when I'm citing research like this. These are findings from specific studies, specific people, specific circumstances, and they're not a guaranteed timeline for anyone listening, but they do point to something worth holding on to. This kind of erosion isn't necessarily permanent, and direct contact with clear, undeniable reality still has real power, even after a long time of being told it didn't. Before I let you go, here's the shape of it. There are two injuries running through everything we covered today. One affects memory, especially when there's no proof to anchor it, where a partner's repeated denial can distort recall itself and keeps working even when they're not in the room. The other affects meaning, even when the proof is sitting right there, undeniable, and the fight simply moves from what happened to what it's allowed to mean. Underneath both sits one mechanism, the need for truth pitted against the need for connection, until self trust erodes and the other person becomes the default authority on what's real. That erosion can reach into how someone narrates their own life, how anchored they feel in their own body, even why some people defend an idealized partner precisely because that image is tangled up with their own sense of self. And recovery, when it comes, tends to arrive not gradually, but at a specific breaking point when the evidence becomes undeniable enough that the other person's credibility simply collapses. What helps after that is fairly consistent. People who treat the account as credible from the start, validation of the reactions that were dismissed for so long, and a return to direct embodied experience. The erosion is real. It doesn't appear to be permanent. That's where I want to leave this one. I'm Esther Adams, and this has been Strides to Solutions.